K8BYP with a serious power supply no-no. Some of us think we know what we're doing. Make the mistake of putting grounded cords on these because they have fallen for the myth that everything must be grounded. The engineers at Drake that put that 2-prong unpolarized cord on this power supply had a reason for it. I absolutely do not put a 3-wire grounded cord on it, and do not ground that cord to the chassis, because doing so defeats any isolation that might be in that transformer. And that goes for almost any other transformer-based power supply, not all of them. But the purpose of the transformers is to step voltages. It also does create some isolation, although it is not. A power transformer is not an isolation transformer. Isolation transformers are about twice the cost, and they're specifically wound for electrical isolation between primary and secondary. That is not one. That power supply chassis is at radio chassis ground, not power utility ground. That's through the transformer. And it is then a code violation to use a 3-prong cord and ground that chassis, because Article 250.24A5 forbids grounding not normally current carrying conductors, and that's what that chassis is. But also another violation to ground that cord, ground that chassis, and connect it to a grounded antenna coax. That's a violation of regrounding at the load. Foolish, ignorant, and dangerous. There is a reason to put a polarized plug on this. If you'll see the zip tie, that zip tie, the head of that zip tie is on the side that must be connected to L1 or hot on the AC outlet, which is the narrow blade. In order to minimize AC leakage from across that transformer, which indicates it's not an isolation transformer because it has a fair amount of leakage. But to minimize AC leakage between the line through that transformer to the chassis to some other piece of equipment. And there was a noticeable AC voltage difference between this chassis and I think it was the ASU. I reversed the plug. Most of it went away. This equipment came from the days before we had grounded outlets for the most part. This is back when electronics used high voltage. Those high voltages are dangerous, can kill easily. So universally, this older equipment was heavily shielded. The high voltages kept within real good chassis, occasionally within plastic chassis, along with the concept of double insulated, so the user can't contact anything energized without going to some trouble to take it apart. The problem with this is if the neutral opens, let's say that, well, like some of the 70s TVs, let's say that's a 1970s TV with a two-blade unpolarized cord. If something in the TV opens up so that the neutral connection is broken, then everything in the TV in theory is at 120 volts AC, because the so-called return side, and I know it's AC, but the common side is open, so therefore everything in the unit goes to 120. Hazardous, serious shock hazard. So to deal with that came the practice in the 70s up in the 80s of having a 3rd wire cord with a ground prong and grounding the chassis such that if the neutral opens, the ground becomes a backup neutral. There is no such thing as ground on that outlet. That is not ground. It's not earth ground. It sure as 4-3 hockey sticks is not ground for a lightning transient. There's probably 250 feet of number 12 wire between that outlet and the ground rod, catty corner, other end of the house. That is not ground. It is a backup neutral. It's ground for the utility, not for the in-house service. I don't care what they call it. The history of this, and I saw a lot of this doing electronic repair back in the 80s, was that backup neutral connection. So it's okay to put a polarized cord on this with the, and doesn't have to be a 3-wire, it can be a 2-wire with one wide blade, one narrow blade, if the polarity is set correctly to minimize AC leakage, and that really helps. I didn't change a cord on this, I just threw a zip tie around it so I know the black is pointing towards the L1, plug that blade in the narrow blade of the outlet. So, a little note on AC line safety from K8BYP and nobody else.